Well, welcome to City Talks. My name is Cam Owens. I'm an associate teaching professor up at UVic in the Department of Geography, and on behalf of Ruben Rose Redwood and the Committee for Urban Studies at the University of Victoria, we're excited to welcome all of you, a full house tonight, to this event with the legendary Mark Lakeman. I want to begin by acknowledging the territories that were gathered on here, those that are now referred to as Songhees and Esquimalt people. Have had many generations relationship with these lands. And as we talk about sustainable communities and things like that, we can think of a model that's been in place for thousands of years here, and also to think that any thoughts of meaningful sustainable community development has to also look very deeply at a meaningful reconciliation with First Nations communities here, something that's very close to Mark's heart. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors here, our co-sponsors, the UVic EU Center of Excellence, the Faculty of Social Sciences, and the Department of Geography for being able to bring these talks. And if I forget to do this later, we do have a series of talks starting up again in January that will be focusing on sustainable communities in particular. So welcome you to come back at that point and to check out our new website, City Talks. We do these once a month, and they're an awesome opportunity to come together and learn about cities in provocative ways. I don't want to do a big lengthy introduction to Mark because you're here to hear him, not to hear me. But I will say that Mark Lakeman is the co-founder of the nonprofit placemaking organization, the City Repair, and principal of the community architecture and planning firm, Communitecture. Mark Lakeman is an urban placemaker and permaculture designer, a community design facilitator, and an inspiring catalyst in his very active commitment to the emergence of sustainable cultural landscapes everywhere. Mark's projects have been celebrated in publications such as Dwell, Architecture Magazine, New Village Journal, Yes Magazine, Yatni Reader, Permaculture Activist, and many more. And with City Repair in 2003, Mark was awarded the National Lewis Mumford Award by the international organization Architects and Planners for Social Responsibility for his work with Dignity Village, one of the United States' first self-developed permanent communities by and for previously homeless people. I met Mark, I think in 2009 when I took students from SFU, and since then I've taken students from the University of Victoria down on a field school studying sustainable communities in the Cascadia region. And honestly, one of the highlights of those trips have been to see Mark in his natural habitat, getting his hands dirty, placemaking in his native Portland. Without further ado, I want to welcome Mark Lakeman. You're in for a real treat tonight.
Well, speaking of treats, it's such a treat to speak in front of people. I know that surveys tell us that Canadians are more afraid of public speaking than they are of death. But among the things that we'll all be doing as we decolonize ourselves is to recover our senses around this and rediscover what a pleasure it is. For one thing, until you stand here and you testify, all these things that are trying to work themselves out don't get to be sort of fused together and then released. And it seems like there's big thoughts and big feelings that wait for such a moment. And I think if you don't get a chance, you develop some spectrum of psychoses instead, like a lot of people in the news these days. Speaking of which, I should just apologize on behalf of the country. I've begged Fernwood neighborhood for years to come down and invade, and they haven't yet, so I'm frustrated. Okay, well, I have a lot of thoughts. Gotta get going here. I don't know where my glasses went. Okay, first of all, this is my daughter, and she's my favorite project right now. Her her name basically means like badass goddess of building culture, no matter what, and going to war whenever she really absolutely has to. That's her first name. And then Plum, second name. And then sacred place of the sacred stone. So we've loaded her up. A lot of pressure on her, but she's definitely here to help. So she's my favorite sort of focus, no matter what else I'm doing these days. So we just had dinner and we were talking about daughters, and I'm hoping that Christine got a little bit of a kick listening to three fathers going on about their children. I think that's a sign of recovery, when men become enthralled and fixated and delighted around being in a family and raising children, taking responsibility and bringing on the next generation. In fact, I've been learning so much and going through so much reinvention through this process that I'm pretty damn sure that patriarchy only persists because of the way that men are divorced from the process of raising families. Pretty damn sure. So, I could go on about that for a long time. So, before I say anything else, I want to say our project was formed on the basis of a 7-year journey of asking indigenous people, people of color from around the world, what they think people, especially living south of this border, but in the Western Hemisphere, need to do. What can we do? And not all people will have the same point of view, wherever they're coming from. But I can tell you, for my part, as I was going around asking, do you have any idea what the hell is wrong with me? Or do you have any idea what's wrong with my culture? Pretty much every person of color that I asked was really happy to talk about it. Like, damn, let's get some food and drink. This might take a while, you know? And I got an earful about colonialism and cultural disruption and just cycles and cycles of degenerative culture, not regenerative certainly. And then sort of got filled up with a lot of different strategies, but you know, you could just get this if you lived in a robust community, village, place-based culture, where you could get the same information as a birthright, where you got to grow up in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and they were powerful together, and they weren't threatened by each other's success. We have so many dystopic aspects that inhabit us as patterns right now. As much work as we have done, as much as we may have been done to, we still are carrying these patterns that are so self-defeating, beginning with the idea that we see ourselves as separate from each other. So I'll be showing you a lot of these incredible strategies that were basically bits of advice, but a lot of what we're here to talk about is participatory culture, culture of design and planning, where we seek mutual benefit. We act, if we can, on each other's behalf. To become a culture where you know each other's heart well enough to not be threatened when someone else takes the initiative to act on your behalf, where they're pretty damn sure they know your heart and they speak. Now, it's not good when you're in a culture of isolation to speak for other people and obligate them. We know this in activist cultures. This happens, especially the most privileged among us, and I have done it for sure. But when you do get to the place where you know each other's hearts well enough and you start to speak on behalf of a whole that you know that you're a part of, then things become possible that you can never figure out mathematically or rationally or read in any book. And frankly, the things that we have to do now have never been done quite before on the scale and scope and magnitude that confronts us now. So there's no rule book, there's no guidebook. There's going to be a lot of trusting of hearts, a lot of stepping back and listening. Speaking of that, I'm proud to tell you that we do center challenged communities and especially Indigenous people in our work. And the core organizing group that is involved leading the daily work every day is entirely people of color, mostly women. So we have come to a new place then, a reinvention of our activism with a deeper, broader focus. It still is inclusive of the spectrum of things we were concerned about before, but now it's more mighty, attracting people from all over the world who want to come learn from super powerful, badass women who direct what we're doing. And that culture has also evolved. Like, you would think, okay, we're gonna be practicing consensus here, everyone's equal around the table, but what if you got like 6 Gandhis in the room, and everyone's like, no, I trust you, you go. Just tell me what to do. We're kind of at this place where people know that the people at the core of our work are so dedicated to everyone else's benefit and are absolutely trustworthy that it's revolutionized how we organize, so that we're much quicker, we're much faster. Our turnaround is almost instantaneous sometimes. Our capacity to create and build doesn't wait for deliberations that we would otherwise have if we didn't know each other's hearts. Now, I'm not saying you can get there instantly, but you could. It might just be a couple of veils between how you are being now with the groups you're working with and how you will be. So my dad said to me, make sure that they know what you want to leave them with. My dad's a big part of this story, so is my mom. They're both activist designers, working on placemaking for a long time. So I want you to know this for sure, among all the other things you might take away tonight, that every neighborhood across the land is inhabited by the full spectrum of muscle and talent and inspiration that really powers your entire society. And yet we live in isolation. Whether it's in the US or in Canada, we have neighborhoods with the lowest number of community gathering places of all first world nations, because we fundamentally don't live in villages that we have made as an expression or a reflection of our knowledge and our energy. We don't have public squares in any neighborhood across the land, almost any neighborhood, because we live in developments that are basically the brainchild of people who can barely say that they love their partners or even hug each other. We live in their mental landscape of absolute reduction. Of course we don't speak, of course we don't say hello, of course we feel threatened, even though you can see that other people around you have thumbs and ears just like you do, which was a project we worked on for a long time, I think. And with that capacity, we have been able to accomplish the culture building that characterizes our species until some kind of paradoxical, more recent time, where some reason, somehow, we feel like we can't even relate to each other. It has a lot to do with the absence of gathering places. As one very conservative person said in one of our meetings, he said, by God, what good is freedom of assembly without a place to assemble? Okay, that's where you scratch the surface of the issue. You can walk outside your door right now and see that there is no gathering place in your community where you don't have to pay for a seat. Okay, but then once you get into that project for a while, you realize, wow, there's no stewardship culture that would otherwise be inhabiting and populating and programming and celebrating in that space. And then deeper, you realize, my God, the cultural rituals that used to characterize the regenerative pulse of evolution, and I'm talking about things like the barn raising, or true holidays based on things like, sowing and harvesting, and ways that we came together to become sort of affected by each other through joy. And then pretty quickly afterwards, through the warm months, we would kiss and make babies, and sort of generate the next wave of society together. All that's missing, and who in the world ever decided that there would be no public square in a Canadian neighborhood, or that we wouldn't have an association? We were talking a little bit about it tonight at dinner, like, just ask Native people, what are the inherent social structures in your community? Because if we have a shared human nature, perhaps we should have those too in the neighborhoods where we're mute and we don't speak. And they would say to you, well, by God, we don't really need fire departments and police forces because we have the great council of mothers. We have the great council of fathers. We have the great council of elders. And we take care of all the shit that needs to get done. And we use it as a means to bring ourselves together and become stronger through every problem that we face. So neighborhoods have a long way to go. I mean, you start to do a little placemaking. That makes you bring people together. That means that you all get to feel new feelings, and you want to do it more, which takes you closer to rituals and social structures. And if we could ever get to that place where the so-called, conservatives and the so-called liberals or progressives or whatever flavor could look each other in the eyes and realize that it's through design that there is no gathering place or inherent social structures, and that is this great missing commons that would otherwise bring us together. So this is just some of the layers of realization that we're talking about tonight. But please know that when you go home tonight, you are surrounded by all the help that you will ever need All you have to do is overcome your fear of asking for help, and overcome this ingrained selfishness that we've been taught to only dream on our own behalf. Start to think about others, do things to delight and surprise. That is magic. Okay, I will forget to tell you that I have brought these things for you. This is an advertisement, actually. My mom is a grandmother version of Indiana Jones, and she writes books about pre-colonized ancient villages, so that people can learn, for instance, with this one, how ancient villages are an ecological response. And then there's one that goes even deeper than that. Also, there's the City Repair Placemaking Guidebook, which is like a cookbook for troublemaking right outside your door. So, I'll just start. I'm going to be complaining a lot about colonialism tonight, and I want to send you out of here unable to not see it anymore. And I'm going to quote a modernist, and I have a lot of problems with modernism, but Arthur Aronson is still a huge voice here, one of the great architects of Canada. And though he was a modernist, he was also a culturalist, and this is what he said about the colonial grid. There has never been a device which embodied greater antipathy to the idea of community than the North American grid. It absolutely prevents an arrival and places of meeting, nodes of concentration and focus, differentiation in the design of streets, and it ignores features of terrain and climate. Patterned on the grid system, streets cannot serve the social purposes of the city as they should and as they always have for millennia. They can only serve as channels for service, a perfunctory way of living, for ways of getting away. Yet the street, not the individual buildings, are what make up the public space of the city. It is the street environment that both reflects and contributes to our civilization, or it does not. So he's right. We'll just go with that, with what he said. Okay, I want to say thanks for having me here to speak on behalf of more people than I even know that are involved in city repair and communitecture and the Planet Repair Institute. Before I go any farther, I think it's time for us to start practicing a little bit of connection with every single time that we come together in community. So please, if you will, just for a minute, turn to the people next to you, just introduce yourselves and say something about where you live in the town before we go any further. Thanks. Most of you live here. We'll be seeing each other again. Please, after tonight, try even more to defeat that tendency to move through the city knowing almost no one around you. And see if you can recognize more people. Pay more attention to who you see around in public space, and try to help yourself to say hello more easily. Not just because of the wonder of what was just now, but as a practice. for your own liberation. Okay, so we're partly funded tonight by an organization that wants us to connect what we're talking about, the urbanism that we're focusing on, to European influences, and that is a really easy thing to do tonight. We're influenced broadly, but we're influenced both positively and negatively in the theory of our work, but also very much in the history of our work. So here we are looking at the plan that Le Corbusier, a famous architect in the beginning of the last century, sort of hatched for the city of Paris, and it was meant to be a prototype for the world. The idea that people would live in these high, dense, tall architectures with open public space in between, and somehow it was going to be this utopia. There was kind of a promise that everyone would become more healthy. And that was the summary that we were given in architecture and planning school, but if you bother to read the rest of the damn book, it was really quite fascist. And I'm sorry for any of you who adore this fellow, but that's got to be over. Because if you read farther into the book, he's designing a concentric hierarchy that basically privileges the people with the most power and money at the center, and then forces the servant class to travel the farthest, and basically perpetually burden them by having to transit space to move from the home zone to the work zone back and forth. Where they're already being paid less than everyone else, and now they have to travel the farthest and be away from their families the most, therefore engendering the most disconnection and difficulty for them as a culture on the perimeter. So, to hell with that. And yet that has come over to this hemisphere, and it's really risen all across the planet. And to me, it's a natural outgrowth. It's kind of like a next chapter in the idea that we should just be perpetually exploiting each other and reducing our quality of aesthetic experience, for sure, along with all kinds of other related issues, ecological, of course, as well. Here's Brasilia, one of the most fascist landscapes in the world, designed by Oscar Niemeyer. And this is quite famous for having been pre-digested and laid out entirely on paper. And while the center of the town might be very sculptural, you might be very satisfied with these forms, the space where people actually live is the most isolationist landscape ever conceived in history of humanity. So what the main problem here is not so much who is not crass in the design process. It's the profound fundamental mistake that some people design the reality that many other people will occupy. That's a big problem. Okay, so and those are influences. These are influences that have, powerfully impacted the world. Here's the most fundamental one, besides the mindset of being invasive. It's the North American grid. And in 1780s, the Dominion Land Survey of Canada and the National Land Ordinance of the USA were both hatched as a way for organizing the commodification of conquered territories. And proscribed in these documents was city form, economic structures, political structures, and every aspect of it, I would say, is absolutely supremacist. Beginning again with the idea that some people should proscribe how others will live. The more that you get into placemaking, the more that you learn about the idea that really we are hardwired to be geomorphic, meaning that we engage with our senses in a place. We figure out the direction of the wind and the light. We alchemize the environment into some kind of village form, and it's an expression of our intelligence. We're learning and building community together as we're doing it. When we sunder that, and we reduce ourselves to mere consumers or mere human resources, working class, whatever sort of description that is projected upon us, and we are disengaged from this fundamental role that we have always had, basically placemaking, then I think everything has a chance to go wrong. So we're looking at the North American grid here, absurdly projected upon various ecologies, none of which have orthogonal lines. Somehow we're trying to fit nature into this organizational structure. And pretty soon, even if you had so-called enlightened people laying out this process, pretty soon you would have people coming in, refining it, and reducing it to the point where, houses would just be repetitious across the landscape, and the people who are making this happen are only thinking of the houses as units for sale and really only looking at a spreadsheet. That's when they really get creative. They've managed to eliminate the things that they can't really sell, like common space, which accounts for a lot. Okay, but there have always been dissenters, and I want to refer to one tonight. This guy I've heard about since I was since I just began to be able to listen and speak. Both of my parents are activist architects, and on the kind of the altar, which was mostly modernist back then, because they'd both kind of gotten out of Southern Ohio and gone to school as the first people in their families to be able to go to university, and they adopted the aspirations of modernism, the worship of technology. But the piece that actually worked with the uprising of the social revolution of the 60s and 70s was this notion that we could design a better world. That was something worth carrying forward and continued to permeate their work until they both retired. But they were deeply influenced by this person, Camilo Site, who had a profound impact at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century in Europe. But then his effects were felt about mid-century here through architecture schools and through basically the dissemination of this wonderful book, basically city planning according to artistic principles. For him, the cause was that the way that cities were being designed with such symmetrical, really academic, antiseptic kind of approach, very just kind of logical and perfunctory, even in the European context where people were designing for themselves. There was this specialist class that was designing for everyone else, and it was becoming reduced and was more concerned with legalities and costs than culture building. So he was a dissenting voice. And his cause was that somehow we mattered, and that our environment should at least be aesthetic and characterized by cultural spaces. And we've moved so much farther beyond this level of concern. But I'll show you some of what he was meaning. Like to say on the left, what the municipality was coming up with in a new neighborhood would instead become this, which was more adapted to the landscape, punctuated by many more kinds of places for people to gather and interact, and a broader program of people, of things that would facilitate spaces and places that would facilitate cultural development and interaction. So he was leading a placemaking cause within the context of Germany and the European context he could affect. He was trying to point out that these precedents that people at the time were so fixated on, that were really very imperial, at the same time had all these aspects of asymmetry in them that made them interesting. It wasn't the symmetry itself. The symmetry served the power, the message and the symbol that was related to power. This is actually the forum in Pompeii, emphasizing kind of the symbols of empire in this case. And he was pointing out the way that the Greeks were very carefully trying to frame and juxtapose objects in the landscape so that somehow it emphasized their importance simply by how they were placed vertically or horizontally in relation to their environment. Now, I want to caution you, I'm only getting a little academic right here. The rest of it's going to be a lot more fun. But this is stuff that we have inherited and built upon that I want to point out, and I want to recommend Camilo Site to you, because then you'll understand more of the design context. Here he is talking about how things exist in relationship to space, but that space cannot be fundamentally orthogonal. Otherwise, people will not want to speak to each other. If spaces are too planar, if they're too linear, if they're too parallel, if they have too many 90-degree angles, then people will not feel comfortable. So space needed to be more fundamentally asymmetrical in order for people to be able to interact with each other more easily, and space would become more interesting if that were the case. He was also observing that such spaces emerge over time, and they don't tend to be something that you can just design all at once, because someone with a T-square and a triangle, or these days a computer, will design something that might be very satisfying to them on paper, but be held to inhabit. It takes interaction. You have to be walking on pathways of ancestors for these kinds of places to actually emerge from our interaction, our consciousness. That edges needed to be animated by wonderful things all around the perimeter that would attract us into that space, so that the open space, which seems to be nothing, is actually the greatest room of the city. Actually brought us the term, Site brought us the term, that the street and the spaces between our homes were actually rooms. We should treat them as such, rooms that we should occupy and build culture in. He pointed out that scale was important. Now this is stuff that people knew before the advent of kind of dictatorial, totalitarian planning actually is what Jane Jacobs would call it, and her great contemporary Sybil Moholy-Nagy, who wrote the book The Matrix of Man, which is the only complete history of the colonial grid that has been written that I know of. So he's talking about the way that heights and widths relate to people's comfort in space, and how pathways enter into a space, and they cannot be symmetrical, they cannot be centered. Pathways cannot be treated in the same way. Here's some just fundamental asymmetries. These are all diagrams. This is basically a language, a simplified graphic language he developed in order to be able to compare spatial kind of configurations across the European context. The pathways need to be adapted to the landscape. They need to be geomorphic expressions. And even if you have to be in the grid, as you see here on the lower left, at least misalign the streets at the intersection so that you're forced to stop and notice where the hell you are. So he was like, you know, where are we going if we're going to treat the world that we're inhabiting, you know, as if it's more important to get from A to B than to experience the journey along the way. So he was questioning the idea of just really raising the question of density. Don't we need a lot of these kinds of places? Don't we need some of them that are linked together? Multiple spaces linked together with the main institutions that we gather in as part of the mix of spaces. So believe it or not, we had lost this intelligence. This is stuff that you might be taking for granted now because it's part of the design vocabulary, even though the profession is failing us utterly. Okay, so Site influenced a lot of people. As I said, I was hearing about him and learning stuff. I mean, as like a second-year-old, a second grader, I could say to you, yeah, never put an object in the middle of a public square, by God, because then you won't be able to dance. You know, it will be in your way. And then and I can tell you as a second grader, the only time you put an object in the center is when some politician wants to dominate that space with the memory of them, a nuclear space. You never do that. So, you know, I don't know if you know about our work already, but we've been transforming a hell of a lot of street intersections across this continent, and none of them have stuff in the center, because you just can't do that. It defeats gathering. Also, there's this idea that Site explained, which is that people need to be able to see that space, even if they don't stand there. If they see that it's open and accessible, then they feel a direct and powerful, intimate relationship that somehow they can possess that center, even in their dreams. Okay, so other people were influenced. Kevin Lynch, some of you have heard of that person, traveled around the world looking to distill the characteristics of the greatest, most robust villages that were basically had more continuity, greater participation, stronger civic institutions, and more robust economies, and were somehow managing to stabilize their populations. And he found that they shared this tendency to have spectacular gateways that welcomed people and invited them to come back. They always had a strong village heart where everyone knew that they belonged. The pathways that connected the infrastructure of the village were wonderful, sumptuous places that compelled people to want to get outside and interact. And then there were nodes that supported all of these other kinds of activities. And then the whole fabric was punctuated by monuments or artistic expressions that kept telling the stories of what had happened in the place. So he traveled around the world to distill these patterns and then express them through education, through the books that he wrote. My mother's been one of these explorers as well, and her layer has been to deeply investigate the way that geomorphic villages are truly expressions of culture, of intelligence, of an interaction with physical environments. And in order to do that, she had to do a study of the characteristics of light as they occur in our reality. And here's all these different ones: color, haze and scattering, polarization, absorption, mixed reflection, refractions, diffuse transmission, all these different wonderful things that we don't tend to think about. But when you are a community that persists over time, her case is, that she makes, is that people actually understand that light has various characteristics, and they design their surfaces to actually be sort of like a light show, if you will, to showcase what is inherent in our reality. So looking through her lens, she did a 25-year study of villages in Tuscany, and then for the last 15 years in Sardinia, to basically look at how the infrastructure that Lynch was talking about is adapted to geography, but especially paying attention to light. The idea that the tower should sweep across the space, kind of like a sundial. The space is not just geomorphic, but actually cosmological when they are designing it to tell them what time of day it is, or what time of season it is, as the shadow lengthens and shortens through the spectrum of time. How it's just so interesting that light just slides down right through the right, aperture in the canopy of the village, or reveals a view just at the edge as the light is coming down and it compels you to see the distant view. Somehow these places rise out of the ground and rise out of us as well. That's the case that she's been making, but of course that it is that the deepest secret is that it's not about the stuff. It's an expression of the life force that we are. City Repair had a lot of native advisors that helped us to form it. Elk River was one of them. And he implored us to realize that, again, that it wasn't about the stuff. He said, if you could just realize that you've been tricked into thinking that you're alone, if you could come to the understanding that you're part of a life force that has never died, and it goes on and on, even though you go back into the ground and a next wave emerges, it's the overall life force that endures. If you could see that that is the greatest scale of yourself and serve that, then we're going to be okay. I think this is all related to urban design, frankly. So here's my mom again on the island of Sardinia, looking at the development of first streets, the interplay between public and private edges, and the way that people are, village by village, you can see them learning through the spectrum of time how to create spaces that meet their needs. The first stairways, how to work it out so that, before this, in time, this was not a stair, it was more of a ramp. And then they realized that they could build it like this. And then it becomes more spectacular, more incredible. There's 8,000 years of megalithic architecture on that island. It's like the Disneyland of world architecture, archaeology. And this is looking up from within one of the multi-towered vertical villages, thousands of them that are strewn across the island. How about this for every neighborhood? Every one of these neighborhoods had an underground water temple. People would get naked and sit around deliberating around a bowl of water. Like, what's really fascinating and worth thinking about is, and a public health scientist would definitely get this, is that they didn't have a punitive view of reality. They were worshipful of the phenomenology that they found themselves in, and they felt that they just returned perpetually, and that their ancestors were never gone, that they were always with them. And in their underground water temples, there would be stairs coming on the ceiling to bring the ancestors in, even as there were stairs on the ground bringing them into the water temple. Here's some more of her research looking at this spectrum of incredible things that are there to see on the island. How about architecture that actually is expressive of an equalitarian urge, a concentricity that isn't just about the fact that we want to see each other's face if we're going to be part of a society of equity, but that we're worshipful of the fact that spheres and circles and cycles permeate our reality, are the fundamental pattern that our existence depends upon, and that is then expressed in the architecture. Wow. And then the village scales it up. And then the goddess, Tanit, in this case, is also an expression of the same principles. I'm really into this stuff. I love settlement patterns. I look at a watering hole like this and see all these pathways converging, and whether it's human beings or animals, this is how the village begins. It's not a developer saying, well, we're going to pay $150 a square foot, and we're going to have 25 houses over here. That's not settlement patterns. That's something, Sybil Maholi-Nagy, that wrote that book, Matrix of Man, she talks about how interesting it was that at the fall of the Roman Empire, all the indigenous societies literally walked away from the Roman constructions that they had been forced to build, and instead regenerated their own indigenous planning and architecture patterns, because they wouldn't live there anymore in a place that didn't support their dignity. It wasn't worshipful of the cosmology. I wouldn't want to live there either. Okay, so our story of how to actually take this advice and start making change in neighborhoods begins with this little thing. This is officially the first little free library in the world, according to articles. Built in 1996. Eventually, the organization littlefreelibrary.org gets started in about 2009, but before then, there was a little library movement happening in the streets of Portland, and it wasn't legal yet. You couldn't put books out in public space, You know, that wasn't legal. Risk managers would be telling you, you know, something could happen. You were like, yeah, damn straight something could happen. People would share books, you know? The thing is, we were trying to figure out how to do almost everything we wanted to see happen. Like, you're interested in alternative economy, you're interested in grassroots democracy, you want to do all of these things related to you know, open source sharing, you want to subvert public space to bring people together and help them realize they're in a freaking colonial grid. You want to get kids involved, you want to slow traffic, you want to beautify the streets and build community pride and get people to talking. So, you know, we invented this thing, and these two little kids were involved in building it, and that's a whole other story. Okay, so now in Portland, Oregon, 22 years later, there's no reason not to get off your couch and do whatever you want, because it's now free and you don't even need to get a permit. You're automatically permitted and insured for what you do in public space. You can install a little free library, you can install a solar-powered self-service 24-hour solar-powered tea station if you want. You're gonna be automatically insured because that's the law now. Yeah, sometimes you gotta start somewhere, and your aspiration is to change the bureaucracy in the city council. But what are you gonna do? Sometimes you gotta think like a permaculturist. How do you get started right now and head in the direction you think you need to go? You could be going the wrong direction, like Shakespeare said. You could be going the wrong direction, just freaking start, okay? You know? So here we now have this opportunity to revolutionize the entire city. This picture shows people occupying the streets, revolutionizing the architecture, retrofitting everything that exists. Instead of building new stuff, because we're trying not to destroy the world, we stop building new stuff and we retrofit what we have to make it work better. And there's all these people out dancing and walking around in the streets, but it isn't even a festival. It's just any old day where people are out playing music and singing and re-inhabiting their place, because they realize, oh my God, we've been zoned to live in the home zone, to transit to the work zone, to make the money to pay for the home zone where we barely get to be. And the more that interest rates rise and our income disparity grows, the less time we have with our children, and the more burdened we are by all these dystopic issues that arise because we're not fundamentally in our own life by design. So here's this picture of what we're doing in Portland, Oregon, and we do have the most trees per capita for sure. The most, you know, I think it's significant, the most coffee shops, that's kind of cool. The most nonprofits, the most participatory culture, the only city in all of North America that has met and exceeded the Kyoto protocols for carbon reduction, and on and on and on. You know, and that's just getting started, because it's a way imperfect city with tons of problems, including a history of white supremacy. And throughout the entire state of Oregon, that was meant to be a white supremacist homeland, actually. So my favorite part of the story is the reinvention and the uprising that is happening from within, that is taking over that culture and rejecting it utterly. Everybody's involved. These homeless villages that you keep hearing about, like, yeah, I love them because I know the people involved. I'm working with them collaboratively, and there's tons of people involved. I'm not having to work as hard anymore as I was to help with this stuff, because so many people are involved. But I'll tell you, like, one of the big reasons I'm involved is because you get to witness the regeneration of urban fabric in a geomorphic fashion when you help with this. Some people are like, no, property values, oh no, things will go wrong. Hell yes, things are already wrong. Things are already happening. Just giving it a chance to go less wrong, for one thing. You up for that? Yeah, but what about the fact that every single freaking woman in that village gets to close a door tonight? Everything changes when that happens. I don't want to hear anybody opposing this stuff. As soon as people are able to take care of each other, everything fundamentally changes for everybody, including the people that are upset that people are sleeping in doorways or under bridges, or they're worried about property values. Those issues don't even matter compared to the fact that a woman needs to be safe and not assaulted 3 or 4 or 5 times a night.
Yeah.
So let's just speak.
Yeah.
Okay, but this is Dignity Village. And they do have the lowest carbon footprint of all human communities in the city of Portland. They have the highest rate of political participation. Their model also costs 25 times less than a typical taxpayer government shelter, supported government shelter, where people are kicked out at the start of the day no matter how cold it is outside, and they can only come back at the end of the day no matter how cold it is outside, and families are broken apart and sent to different institutions. And that doesn't happen here at all. And it costs about $3.50 a night per person for them to be here. And then they get to be part of a participatory culture where they get to be accountable, they get to learn collaboration, they get to find their voice. So the restorative processes are priceless, and everything costs multiple times less. This is an expression of what we keep trying to mean by democracy, and frankly, it's anarchy too. Because it's a self-regulating society where people don't even need to know the rules, because they are mostly, motivated by their feelings for each other. So it's a big deal. And then so many different versions of this. If you don't do the first one, then you don't get to see the miracles of the next ones. Like this one, about 12 people that really seem a lot like Gandhi. They're like, no, don't try to pay me. There's too many people to take care of here. I don't need a job. Can't you see all these people are dying in the streets and they need care? So somehow this group of people is taking care of 100 people at night. They're somehow managing to get their bedding clean during the day, and then when people come back for a place to sleep, and it's all just made out of just stuff from the waste stream mostly. R2D2, it's called, the Right to Dream 2. The Kent Women's Village. This thing cracked the whole issue open. People are used to fighting against these models because, oh no, those people aren't from our community, or oh no, it's going to affect property values. So here's the Kent Women's Village, where the Kenton neighborhood is actually housing the most vulnerable women of their community. Domestic violence survivors, houseless women now have a place, and this community is saying to others across the North American continent, what are you doing for your own most vulnerable women? So it's a place-based model which changes everything. It's also designed and built by 15 of the most dynamic architecture and planning offices, where they designed the prototypes and the mayor funded them, and all of these other people came in to collaborate and support and give in-kind materials. That model is now traveling across the country and landing in different versions, different forms, in even in conservative townships like this one, Oregon City, where they've adopted the same model for their homeless veterans. So they said, as a conservative community, we're not open to just anybody, but we're open to helping houseless veterans. So that's where they begin. And the model of a place-based, kind of democratic, sort of antivirus begins in their community. This thing can take so many different forms. Since we're talking about urbanism, we're not just talking about stuff, we're talking about social cultures, all kinds of different structures that are not just physical. So this is the Rebuilding Center before it was built into this. It's a structure with the most recycled and natural content of all architecture in the country. But what's most fundamentally important here is that the organization of the people who run this place all have power together in the culture. Everyone comes from within walking distance, so it's a zero carbon commute. It's dedicated to that community, and everyone has living wages, and their families are all covered for full health, mental and dental benefits, physical benefits, while they get a living wage. And everything, so weird. They get paid way better than they do at Home Depot, and yet everything costs way less to everyone in the community, which is most substantially because they're running their own place and they're not being dominated by a corporate extractive mechanism. Everything begins to change then. So the connection to the community obviously will become much stronger, but what they do is they take stuff out of the waste stream and recondition it and make it available to people to be able to buy for pennies on the dollar. This is in northern British Columbia for Prince Rupert. There's a large native community in that town with 4 different quadrants, each represented by a different totem character, and all of them coming together as one culture. And they're absolutely wild about basketball. I don't know if you know about this, but they go out to meet the Chinese on these floating platforms, and then they play basketball out in the ocean. And then every powwow apparently features chow mein before anything else. It's this whole wonderful story of cultural fusion going on. Yeah, there's tons to say about this, but in the lower right you can see there's this kind of temple to basketball with each of the corners featuring a representative totem of each quadrant of the town. This is working with Cesar Chavez's organization Cocoon. This is the most energy efficient office building in the country.
and it cost a quarter of what it would normally cost because they used the creation of it as an opportunity to mentor kids. It's a mentorship facility for training youth on, to learn how to do public speaking and fundraising and community organizing, but they began the process with digging the foundations and raising the walls and learning how to draw. We were drafting with them to teach them how to draft. And gosh, all this infill co-housing, including for people on the autistic spectrum and with Asperger's. I know that you might think, well, that's completely impossible. How in the world could you be doing that? But I think that there's a lot of things that we've been thinking were impossible the whole time that turn out to be kind of stuff we've already figured out and we've forgotten we even had to work out. Here's an absolutely insanely wonderful permaculture landscape. This entire 25 acres drinks water. I mean, there isn't a drop that leaves the site. Again, it's an expression of a participatory culture. This is in Washington, and it's a peer-based village for helping people contending with Asperger's to come and learn life skills, how to basically be in a social context with others while they install this extensive permaculture network of systems. Okay, I'm taking you from a little free library. Personally, I had abandoned a career in architecture because of a huge toxic waste cover-up in the firm where I was working. And as I was traveling around the world asking what the hell was wrong with me and my people, I came back with these ideas, and all I really cared to do was build that library. And then that just led to stuff because it was the thing that needed to happen. So and I was just one person in that process. I'm not taking credit for layers and layers of community process when I'm telling a story. So that leads to participation in this, redesigning multiple cities in the Bay Area to try to use the crisis of climate change as an opportunity to deal with so many compounding issues that have been besetting us the entire sort of history of colonialism in this place. So here we are looking at compounding water issues at the edge where the municipal wastewater treatment plants are always located at the bottom of the watershed. So water's rising, storm events are happening, driving water in against the city, while a storm is inundating the landscape and all the water is converging and then killing the bacteria in this wastewater treatment plant, and then all the systems of the city shut down and people are fucked. And that's a quote from a wastewater treatment engineer in San Leandro in San Francisco Bay. He said, politicians are just all playing with us. It's all about power. Every wastewater treatment engineer in this entire country, conservative or liberal, we all know that climate change is real and it's happening fast. And when our bacterial cultures are killed, they're taking decades to create, like bacteria that's so voracious it'll eat the poo of an entire town in a day. He's like, you can't just recreate that on any kind of timeline that we know of. So we're all fucked in that case. Okay, I think it's good to get real about this stuff. I'm not just going to be motivated by joy all the time. I got to be a little cynical too. Here's a cross-section looking through Oakland at all the different kind of conditions of vulnerability. All this infrastructure down at the water edge, it's all going to be inundated. You've got all these communities of color and low-income communities basically sitting on brownfields and in very vulnerable places with respect to rising waters. And the entire landscape is vulnerable, including the people who thought they were safe by being up in the hills and the forests that are now beset by fires. So this entire thing is a really poor design in many ways. So here we are looking at a typical cross-section and coming up with some outrageous solutions to basically re-village, especially where working class people are. The Rockefeller Foundation was paying for this, and they were like, believe it or not, they said this, we need you to design like a force of nature. Disrespect government structures, property lines, and insurance programs, because climate change doesn't care about any of that. You need to tell us how things need to change. How are we going to grow food locally? And I'm just sitting there like, am I dead? I never thought I'd hear something like this from a person's mouth like that. And they're just going on and on. They're like, the oceans will rise as much as 200 feet. We're hearing that from the Einstein of climate science. So he's like, nobody in the Bay Area is getting real. They're all thinking that maybe they're going to stop it at 3 feet without any political intervention. Ain't happening. So here we are looking at the entire neighborhood fabric. Where are the gathering places? Where are the nodes? Where are the gateways? How are we going to recreate these roadways into pathways that compel people to interact? We're going to spot zone, for one thing, so that people can work where they live. They're going to be able to basically recreate the effect of the crossroads that brings people together by enabling limited commercial enterprise that supports a pedestrian culture, just to get started. And every block should look something like this, where there are gathering places and commons that are somehow engendered between people that enable them to come together. And all these systems that we already know how to create, like gray water and humanure, water catchment systems, for sure in every house. And keep in mind, the basis of all of this is starting to create a localized economy and a much more connected fabric. Absolutely solar-powered water, hot water and solar electric, perennial and annual agriculture systems, affordable infill housing everywhere, and then all of it cumulatively looking like this. And of course this means a political rewiring that actually engenders this effect of the demos, once again. Like, democracy actually is referring to a subset of people that live in proximity to each other, which is the demos. And so we're looking at the block this way and saying, at this scale they should be able to re-village and then scale up so that the entire fabric of the community has all of these localized, redundant systems so that if anything fails, everything else is going to still be working. Across the water from Vallejo, Mare Island has 3 million square feet of remnant naval architecture. So in looking at that as permaculturists, we're like, well, what we really have to do is just bring together all the problems. We have no problems yet. Get them all together, stack them up and see how they relate, because we're not going to solve anything without seeing it and solving it systemically. So 3 million square feet, and then the entire island become basically a way to meet a spectrum of challenges that are already identified in all of these different reports through community workshops. And now at last, we basically say all these immigrant people and all these houseless people that are looking for family wage jobs and places to live with their families ought to be able to have a place in this, while the rest of the bay that desperately needs a sustainable sort of technology to retrofit the landscape, all of that gets brought together along with educational institutions to help everybody train up. So looking at cross-section of the land, there's all these different sort of features that are actually coming from the voice of the people of Vallejo, including a regional grieving center. Because frankly, in the USA, we need places for people to come together and feel deeply and communicate with each other about what the hell is happening in our culture. Here's just a look at some of that remnant architecture where people will be living with their families, having living wage jobs, and producing resilient technology while also growing food for themselves. This is a retrofit of most of San Francisco here. This is the idea that, okay, we're going to stop the water from coming off the land. For one thing, it's a parched condition of an extended drought. Why don't we stop using the sewer system as a way of getting rid of water and instead use it as a way of catching water? Millions of gallons of water. Okay, obviously that's a problem if you've got waste in the system, so all of these different upstream interventions are invented in order to catch every drop that's coming on us and then recondition and reuse every aspect of gray or black water that we possibly can in every single circumstance in private and public space. So here's some of the things we already know how to do. We already know how to catch and store water. We already know how to recondition or repurpose, redesign remnant public spaces and make it into lush ecologies that drink water and also bank it into the water table. We can tear up parking lots and turn them into giant underground cisterns while also creating new public spaces for places like farmers markets. And then whole institutions in our landscapes can be turned into ways to not just store water underground or above ground, but also to grow food. Frankly, that's a lot of thinking and drawing and talking and meeting. Sometimes we just go out into the forest, like at the Pickathon Festival, where we build massive landscapes of just branch structures, where we pick stuff up and we just create stages and gathering places and all sorts of different environments where people do things with each other. And it's all just made spontaneously out of forest materials. And that's a way of recovering our senses too, because by God, are you really going to live a life where everything you do has to be drawn, digested, and funded first? What about spontaneity? I think it's a birthright to create directly with each other and to make environments. All my life I've been asking, what the hell is the point? I keep hearing about this notion of the American dream. Yeah, to have a family and a house, yay. I think that's everyone's dream, and it should be a birthright, and it shouldn't be so much of an aspiration. I keep asking myself, what's the most fundamental way that all of these things come together? And as a culture, as an organization, this is our answer. That everyone who loves anyone, wherever they are, needs to be able to love and express that love in public space, in freedom, right now. And we think that if that is the point, then all the bioswales and all the living roofs and all the social infrastructures will fall into place if we honor that like highest aspiration. And again, that comes to us from our friend Elk River. He's like, friendship was the highest value and the most sacred word. Build your economy around that. Also, that we need to rejoin our sense of our identity with nature. Reject this notion that nature and humanity are separate, which is taught actually in design school. It goes hand in hand with Le Corbusier's city of concentric hierarchy. So reject that utterly and create ways for us to interact with nature once again in the city in every opportunity we can. To realize that all this gentrification that's happening around us is just another wave of the same invasive impulse that's been happening in this place for way too long. And take it personally. Walk across the landscape of these destroyed stories. Pick up the nails that were made by hand and driven forever as one person was mentoring a young, as an elder was mentoring a young person and driving those nails with a commitment, being fed by a mother who came from within walking distance, to bring the food to feed the children and the father in this case. Yeah, it was a society with a lot of problems, but they were making a commitment even as they were themselves invaders. So it's not perfect at all, but feel it as you walk across this and ask yourself this: will everything that I create in my life also be utterly wasted? Because this is what we're allowing to happen right now to our own ancestors and their stories. What's the difference between an indigenous village and one that is in the colonial grid? I mean, look at, there's pathways that intersect, but the intersections bring people together all over the fabric. The blocks are characterized by open space so that everyone can come together, constantly coming together in common space. You don't have to say, let's find some freaking common ground around here, unlike everybody who lives here. Whoops, we forgot the common space in the middle of the block, even though your ancestors had it for thousands and thousands of years. Whoops, there's no place to gather at the place where our lives come together. We just forgot about that, apparently. No, there wasn't any forgetting. The Dominion Land Survey and the National Land Ordinance are both based upon Roman colonialism, which was imposed violently as a means for organizing conquered people so that they would not have their own ideas anymore. This is where we find ourselves. Of course, houses would become units. Do you know Lizzie Maggie invented the game Monopoly in the beginning of the last century as a way of helping North Americans understand the implications of the Dominion Land Survey and the Land Ordinance? Yeah, you go around and around, you collect a little money in order to go around another cycle. Hopefully you notice right away that the only form of commons is a jail and a parking lot. You should be asking, like, where's the library? Where's the civic center? Where's the art museum? Where's the freaking park? Public square. Ain't happening. So, you go around and around and you're tearing down houses, yay! Putting in these larger structures as if that's fun to play gentrification. But take out your magnifying glass and look closely. You'll see all these little people running around going, oh no, what about our children? What about our social relationship? Where will they go to school? What about new jobs? Oh no! What's going on here is you live in his head, played out in the world. Like, really? White men, the narrowest slice of the entire pie of humanity, get to proscribe onto the world how everyone else will live? And it's literally, as Lydia Dolman, one of our great leaders in Portland, has said, these guys literally can't hug each other or tell their wives they love them, and now we live in the landscape of their imagination. Don't wait anymore. You can't. You just must not wait anymore to make place in your life. Like, it's just insulting to have to be reduced this way. Okay, this is the great insult, to stop you from your hardwired, biologically and spiritually hardwired proclivity to make magic in this world. This is the fabric of the great village, and it's geomorphic, and it can take all kinds of different forms, but a network of places that are held together by interesting journeys of pathways. By God, foxes would not put up with this shit. Some developer fox comes along and says, oh, I've got a great idea. How about if I liquidate your den and then you can go live in a trailer in Arizona for $5 a night? I'll get rich. No way. thoughts would not put up with it. Cliff swallows would not have it. The idea that a developer could make their little village for them. For one thing, they'd all become obese because they become so disengaged. Their lives would become less meaningful because they were no longer, creating their own reality. And let's not even get started on termites. Nobody can make a termite mound. No termite developer can do this. It takes termites making this place, like licking the walls of their environment in order to regulate temperature while their little termite thumbs are like testing the airflow, and then creating all these different mold spores for their queen and their kids. Freaking no way. And we allow this to happen to us? This is a joke. Yay, a village. I think I'll pull over. Surely there will be a grandmother here somewhere making me a sandwich. Ain't happening. It's like people use place names to compel you to come consume. Like, I've even seen Stonehenge apartments. But I looked. The apartments are not aligned with the rising summer solstice at all. There wasn't even a commons in the laundry area. Okay, so here are these North Americans. And this is before cars even existed, And sure, we were living in the colonial grid, but still, as had happened for thousands of years, the biggest thing that happened in the streets was a birthday party. Like, that was what streets used to be for, because they were a great room that brought us together. But look at what's happening out here. There's all this commerce. People are moving stuff around. People are talking. There's all this interaction. There's even this community selfie happening here, and nobody's getting killed. So they're in the colonial grid, but somehow the space was still theirs until about 1920, when somebody said, oh, streets are now just for cars. It was about 1920 when it happened in Canada and the USA, where the federal government, at the behest of oil and automobile industries, said, let's invent the crime of jaywalking and force everyone to only walk long straight lines and turn 90-degree angles forever from now on. All right, so there's a reason why we save our money to fly across the ocean to go visit places that look like this, where we can see little girls sitting on the laps of their grandmothers. If you watch closely, you notice that they're hearing the songs and stories. The regenerative effect of our people endures. Like, they wouldn't put it in those words, but that's what's happening. And this is like the emblem of a sustainable culture. Right here, this is absolutely what it's about. So that a little girl can become an older little girl and a young woman and eventually a grandmother and have a place within this cycle of being. And the same thing is true for boys becoming men and then elders. Frankly, if this doesn't happen, as we're seeing all across North America, men definitely go crazy without this essential relationship to their community. This is a photo from my Indiana Jones mom, looking at one of the great commons that people used to create together before they were forced to believe they were separate somehow. This is a water commons that people use their hands to get down through the rock to create in a landscape of great extended drought. You're looking from deep within the earth up at the surface. And there's double helix stairways bringing people down and back up as they bear water to bring the water back up. This is a Sardinian village. Amazing that we haven't really heard about passive solar design until the 70s, when many people's ancestors were doing this thousands and thousands of years ago. And the island of Sardinia, unfortunately, and actually fortunately, is in many ways typical. 6,000 multi-towered vertical villages with these piazza bellies aimed at the south to bring light into the center of the community. Somewhere along the way, they're invaded, their cultures are sundered, and all this forgetting is engendered as they are conquered over time. But again, this is the thing to remember. It's the life force of the people that is really what endures or does not, despite the evidence that is left behind. Which brings us to the revolt of the pawns, my favorite metaphor. And I think it works for us tonight. You know how this game works? It's the game of the kings. You never duck, don't take the king. Can't take the king, because it's his game. Apparently the whole reality is the king's game. So I like to play it this way. During the night, the chess pieces get a different idea and they decide to meet in the center. These are community organizers. A darker one comes from over here to the center, a lighter one comes from over here, and they meet in the middle, and they say things like, I'm so sorry for what happened in that last game. We came out, we attacked you, and you attacked us, and we all killed each other, and then the tall, oppressive ones with funny hats behind us, they came out and attacked each other, and this game is just designed to be unsustainable. So they trade sides, and they're talking to the other pawns, like, you guys are always talking about getting out of the box. thinking outside the box. You fools, what do you see? We're in boxes. And the punk's like, well, this is our job. We can't dissent. We'll lose our jobs. We won't be able to pay for our reality. Fortunately, they managed to get into small groups with facilitators. They're sitting there crying and hugging, and they're like, oh my God, my childhood was so oppressive. And people are like, me too. And everyone starts to go, oh my God, we were isolated from each other and didn't realize we were going through the same thing. We were even sharing our isolation. And then they go to the back row to confront their oppressors, and these people are like, you know, who, us? We never took more than our share. What are you talking about? The moms get pissed. I like this one. But of course what has been happening the last few decades for us has looked a lot more like this, where people are saying, it's true, I have way more than my share, and other people are saying, I've got all these ideas and I will not stop. All these people want to help. It starts to look like this, and the organizers are saying, like, get out of your box and see if we can see each other's face, how interesting it looks like a circle. And they start trying out these ideas. Meanwhile, all these other chessboards start to hear what's happening. The kings and queens are getting nervous. They're like, oh no, they're starting to figure out how we play the game. Meanwhile, the pawns are realizing that their time has come at last. Meanwhile, back on the first board, they are rocking out the place. They're like, let's get some freaking furniture around here. So they get a little dining room table, a video player, a little rocket stove here. They've designed some perennial gardens, and they're having a little harvest festival. They've got 3 Asian pears and squash, actually. And a couple of hot tubs down here. This thing is what I'm talking about. Every neighborhood, every place where people feel isolated is infused, is populated by the power and the muscle that powers the entire society. We've been tricked into thinking that anywhere in the world is mundane. You know, anywhere in the world is boring. And yet it's all a freaking miracle. And that's a way to recover our senses. Like, oh my God, everything's fucking amazing. You know, like it's true. Elk River was saying to us, notice that the economy of the universe is always giving you stuff for free. If you can kind of get in a groove with that, you're going to be okay. So this is like, let's just challenge the notion that things are impossible and transform what we've taken for granted the whole time into the miraculous, something like that, like this. This is in a street intersection and people are getting married by their own neighbors. You know, I was saying earlier about like place, and then stewardship culture, and then ritual. The return of the barn raising is where we find this greater scale of our local self. And we party, and we learn together, and we all become musicians. And this notion, the colonial city, the definition of it is that everyone is a specialist within it. And the villager definition of humanity is that everyone has, you know, specialized skills, but that we're all generalists, and we all understand and can relate to each other's strengths by sharing in that. So the trick that we're in is that we all transit across the landscape in this perfunctory way, needing money for most of our interactions, and at the end of the day we might not even know another person's name. And what we're saying, and what we have now done 700 times in Portland, more than 700 times, is to build gathering places so people can know each other locally, and then build relationships and localize their economic activity so that they don't even need to leave where they live. They can get their needs met while they go possibly zero carbon and also make the streets freaking safer and are present in their lives to mentor their children and endlessly on. Okay, so we've been transforming, we've been saying, okay, the grid is a trick. It nullifies the tendency for people to gather at these convergence points. Looking at this as Camilo Site would have us, these spaces need to be recognized as nodes, and then they need to be populated as expressions of our participation. The first time this happened was where people were kind of rediscovering their relationships to each other because of a certain tea house installation that we had built as our first project. And all these people around here were talking about how they had all these complementary skills and talents, like, oh my God, we all eat, there's a chef. There's a plumber, we all have plumbing, oh my God. You know, there's an architect who could work with a contractor, who could work with a plumber and an electrician and a landscape, you know. And then 5 minutes later it looks like this. Everyone's just shocked, like, oh my God, we could all be doing stuff. Not just working. Like, everyone has all these common interests as well. So we had this realization. We called the Department of Transportation. We said, hey, we want to repurpose an intersection. There's 22,000 of them in the city. How about we turn one into a public square like our ancestors used to have? And they were like, you know, don't talk to us about this. Even though we're in charge of all the public space, we know nothing. about history, we're just engineers. So we did it anyway. We got in trouble, and within 3 months this was legalized for everyone to do all across the city as many times as anyone wanted to for free. Now how in the world did we do that? Obviously we had a pretty awesome city council, like it sounds like you guys do. And even though they had never seen anything like this before, they could see when we held up the objectives that were established for the entire city to slow traffic, engage youth, build gathering places, increase all these livability indicators, address all of these fundamentally broken public health indicators and reverse them, and they saw that we were doing it, this was unanimously supported. So here's that first little free library on your right. Here's the first 24-hour solar-powered self-service T-station, really. All these other little things that started to accrete on the corners, and it's really like regenerating the village like a garden, like little starts and seeds, but you're regrowing culture there, and it's all fed by participation, and not surprisingly, yards start to become gardens. The kids got in on the program. They're like, okay, so if the Romans actually started this whole thing, let's make centurion-shaped pinatas and beat the hell out of them, and then have candy. Okay, so these kids all live on this intersection, and they created the stuff on the corners, and they got to basically design, like this, these places don't get vandalized. You get the vandals involved at the start, as to make it into a cultural expression of them, and then they get on to more creative pursuits. And I really think there's a direct relationship there. Kids need to mark the world. They need to express themselves. And if you don't have a way to do that, you're criminalizing your own kids. Okay, so you get more friends than you can possibly even call back, which makes you powerful. And there's so many stories in this landscape, I can't even start to get into all of them right now. But the point of this is to regrow the village from within the grid. Don't abandon the city and go live in co-housing elsewhere, but to take a stand, basically democratize your landscape, reclaim your power, and like what we've got here. This is the first and only place-based form of self-governance in the history of the United States. And now they're all over the place. So we're obviously regrowing the tips of the tree of our culture, which stands to then feed the nutrients and minerals and moisture back into the body of the tree that has been dying. I think that's a really apt metaphor. The 4 blocks around that space are being affected with basically enhanced porches, pathways that connect people through the interiors of the blocks, annual and perennial gardens, most of them shared, play spaces, natural building and permaculture installations, perennial and annual agriculture, lots of saunas. Getting naked seems to be inevitable in this case. Lots of openings in the center of blocks that require the dismantling of fences and the installation of pathways. The yellow areas show permaculture master plans and installations. Houses being retrofitted with natural and recycled materials. Lots of localized economics, including this zero carbon preschool. And then all these kids become, you're growing leaders, like this young woman here, whose brilliant idea it was to put in localized bioswales to handle runoff from streets in order to feed the landscape of perennials that would support the edible agriculture aspirations of this community, but without needing water to be brought in from elsewhere, simply by installing curb cuts. And you might have seen these before, but this is the first one in the country. And it happened because this woman spoke out, and her community of adults was basically woke up enough to say, hell yes, let's do that, let's do what she said. So, gosh, urban agriculture is now possible in thousands of miles of residential right-of-way. It was a few elder grandmothers who made it legal in collaboration with the city council. Now it's available for everyone to grow food in the right-of-way, including fruit and nut trees. So big strides toward food security. Now it's legal to be able to install interactive kiosks all across the city on every single block, every block face, for free. The city council just asks that you let people know that you're doing it. But they can be anything, and they can be electrified by the sun. All these different kinds of prototypes are now possible. You can install them for free as well. Planters in the streets to constrict traffic flow while you're supporting pollinators or growing food. Community trellises that span over sidewalks. Covered bike parking facilities, solar-powered cob kiosks. It's now possible to do community composting in the streets for free on 6,000 miles of residential right-of-way. Nothing's stopping people from getting out there. This is an urban food forest with 84 varieties of edibles and a 7-layer vertical kind of garden effect with this food forest. Oops, I'm getting ahead of me a little bit here. This is the first time it replicated in the Sunnyside neighborhood where the sunflower is the logo of the neighborhood. This is a congressional delegation visiting outer southeast Portland and the suburbs. These are people from other states and cities coming to see how this happens. This is an homage to Buckminster Fuller. I don't know why these kids decided to paint their houses onto the backs of native birds, but that's not my business. Really, to get beyond aesthetic judgment and just be joyful over what you see people expressing, because it's their damn metaphor. Release the judgment. It's the city of roses. So there's a lot of roses in the streets these days. These are the major sort of flora and fauna of the Northwest region here. If these kids want to put a Tyrannosaurus Rex coming out of a manhole cover to eat cars, it's their business. And these kids were like, wouldn't dinosaurs be pissed if they knew that cars were burning fossil fuels? Because that's the bodies of dinosaurs. Wouldn't a Tyrannosaurus Rex eat cars? Therefore. And wouldn't Superman say, let's get rid of this damn thing in his mouth? Of course. And that's how you get the kids involved. It's their idea. It'll definitely attract them to want to play and be in space. Celtic knots in the street, yes please. Mid-century modern couch pattern apparently. So the idea is all over the freaking city. And then, because we know, those of us who kind of feel about this and study a little bit know that there are city-states imposed over resistant cultures all over this planet. So the strategy here is to create and pump out the most epiphanous, inspiring stories so that people, wherever they are, claim their own place and act up in their own way that is fueled by beauty and love and creativity and is unstoppable. So in this way, each node in the overall network of cities can act in concert without even coordination to change the world. That's the plan, to act like nature. Here we are looking at this mycelial web that underlies every forest floor that is basically an intelligence network where the crossing of the strands is where information is exchanged that redirects moisture and nutrients to distressed plants. If we act like that, and therefore like villagers once again, we can do anything. And it also helps to have an abundant perspective that the sun freaking rises every day. And that's the front page news all the time. The air is always there for us to breathe for free. Bodies are held together by these atmospheres of pressure. The world is there for us to stand on as a gift. Everything is a freaking gift. And if we have to pay for anything, it may well be a trick. So the city of Portland seems to realize this. And again, I want to say we are so not perfect. We're dealing with this supremacist culture that we're throwing off as mightily as we can, beginning with the creation of the first public square. My dad was very, very helpful in this project, so I got to learn a lot about this even as a little kid, the fights that were going on to try to stop this, where the mayor of the city said, I'm not going to let that happen. He said this on the news. I'm not going to let that happen because then the community will gather. People were like, thanks, mayor, that weekend. Like, thanks for telling us what time it is. So it went out on the rooftop of this 2-story parking garage, and we turned it into a public square that very weekend. And then it went on to become one of the greatest public spaces in all the world. And that was just the beginning, but it was the first social commons in our colonial city-state in the history of Portland, Oregon. And that was just to get started. Now we do have the most bike lane miles and the most bike commuters by far. We have the most green buildings. We have more than 50 farmers markets across the city every week. And we've even got transportation staff putting banana slugs on bike lanes, and that's not even legal. So I think something's good. We have the first major public bridge in the country that accommodates all other forms of transportation except for cars. This is a reason to come to Portland. The food, music, and artistic culture is absolutely through the roof and maybe like nothing that's ever been seen before. We really do have the shortest distance between where food is grown and where it's consumed of all cities. Oops.
bike ride.
We also have the greatest, biggest naked bike ride in the world. I think it's in July every year, changes a little bit, but if you have not cruised down East Burnside with the wind rushing between your legs and open space, you have not lived. Come to Portland for this, if nothing else. So the idea has been to have a compounding impact. It just emanates and ripples, and then ripples back and reinforces and builds and builds and inspires. And this is just a few of the things that have happened in the city. It's out of hand, and it's not perfect. But that's the story I brought tonight. Thanks.